Okay, hey guys. Today we're going to do a lesson about birth and lactation. So we're going to be going over all the different hormones that are involved in this, from relaxin to oxytocin to prolactin to progesterone and estrogen, and just kind of go over the whole process of how birth happens and how lactation happens. So we'll start with the birthing process, which is also called parturition. The first hormone that is released prior to labor actually starting is something called relaxin, and it's released from the placenta. And relaxin's job is to just relax things. So it relaxes the cervix, the vaginal muscle walls, as well as the pelvic bone ligaments. So essentially, the entire birth canal just becomes looser and more relaxed. The second hormone that's released is cortisol, and that's actually released from the fetus itself. And what cortisol does is it converts progesterone into estrogen. Now, progesterone is constantly being produced by the placenta, and it's getting produced more and more as pregnancy goes on. And so the level of progesterone keeps increasing. And then right as labor is about to start, the cortisol is going to cause all of that progesterone to get converted into estrogen. The progesterone levels will drop off, and that will initiate the onset of labor. The estrogen that has now been produced from the converted progesterone then stimulates the production of oxytocin and oxytocin receptors in the muscle layer of the uterus, which is called the myometrium. The oxytocin then binds to those receptors, and that's what causes the uterine contractions. All of that muscle layer of the uterus starts contracting because of the oxytocin. And then another hormone called prostaglandins is also released at the same time. It builds up in the women's bloodstream, and it also causes contractions. Labor can be induced artificially by injecting either prostaglandins or synthetic oxytocin into the woman, and that would cause contractions as well. So this is a chart we've seen before when we were looking at the menstrual cycle, as well as fetal development, I think. Just looking at how we switch over from all of the progesterone and estrogen coming from the ovary to coming from the placenta instead. And so as you can see here, the level of progesterone goes up throughout the pregnancy, and then right at the end here, this is where the cortisol would be released, and you see a big drop in progesterone and a sharp increase in estrogen, and that's because the cortisol is converting the progesterone into estrogen. We also see a big spike of the oxytocin at the end there when it starts being produced. The oxytocin that's present prior to that isn't actually going to be causing very many contractions because there's not going to be very many oxytocin receptors prior to right before labor. And then during the actual birth, uterine contractions will grow stronger and stronger and closer together because of positive feedback. This is the first positive feedback loop that we've seen so far this year. So what happens is the oxytocin causes uterine contractions, and then the uterine contractions stimulate the posterior pituitary to release more oxytocin, which causes more contractions, which causes more oxytocin to be released, and so on and so on. And so you just get this building and building of this labor process and of the contractions and stuff like that. While that's happening, the cervix is also going to thin and dilate. It needs to dilate to about 10 centimeters before the woman can start pushing. But yeah, that needs to widen so that the baby can fit through the birth canal. During most of pregnancy, there is what's called a cervical mucus plug, which is a plug of mucus that blocks the cervix. And it contains antimicrobial substances that protects the developing embryo and fetus from bacteria and stuff like that. But as the cervix dilates right before birth, the cervical plug will just kind of fall out. And when that happens, the amnion, which is the sac that goes around the baby and all the amniotic fluid, that sac starts to kind of dip down into the cervix, and the pressure that builds up in there ruptures the amnion, ruptures the sac. And so all of the amniotic fluid that's in there rushes out of the woman. That's when her water breaks. So when a woman's water breaks, it's really the amniotic fluid coming out. And that acts as a bit of a lubricant for the birth canal. So yeah, at the onset of labor, contractions are usually every 15 to 20 minutes and last for at least 40 seconds. And then again, those contractions will build up and build up during labor until eventually it pushes the baby right out. After that, the uterus will continue to contract until it dislodges the placenta and then expels that. That's referred to as the afterbirth. And then, of course, the umbilical cord has to be cut and tied off and all that kind of stuff. There are some circumstances which would require a C-section instead of the natural birth we just described. So if the baby's upside down, or if the umbilical cord is around its neck, if the mother has an STI, or the baby just gets stuck because the mother's birth canal is too narrow, all of those could result in a C-section. And then lactation is the production and secretion of breast milk. So breasts start to develop right after puberty because of a buildup of the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone. During pregnancy, estrogen and progesterone levels are higher than normal, which helps prepare the breast for milk production. Each breast does have about 20 lobes of glandular tissue called mammary glands, and each mammary gland has a duct that carries fluid towards the nipple. Those mammary glands are excretory glands, meaning that they excrete to the surface of the body. Those glands will increase in size over pregnancy in order to prepare for lactation at the end of pregnancy. Prolactin is the first hormone that is necessary for lactation. Prior to birth, estrogen is going to stimulate a bunch of prolactin to be released into the mother's bloodstream, but it doesn't start working there at that point. When the estrogen is causing the prolactin to be released, progesterone is still being released from the placenta, and progesterone actually inhibits prolactin from working. However, after birth, when the placenta is expelled from the body, estrogen and progesterone levels both fall because they're no longer being produced by the placenta. And so once the progesterone levels fall, the prolactin will no longer be inhibited and will start actually working. The prolactin will initially stimulate the mammary glands to produce colostrum, which is a fluid that contains a bunch of sugar and protein, but not a lot of fat. And then a few days after that, the prolactin will start stimulating the production of milk. Both of those contain antibodies that can help protect the baby from infection. And then the second hormone necessary for lactation is oxytocin. Prolactin causes milk to be produced but not secreted. Oxytocin is required for the milk to actually be released from the milk glands. And so the way that happens is the baby will suckle. That will stimulate nerve endings in the areola. That nerve impulse gets sent to the pituitary gland and stimulates it to release oxytocin. Oxytocin causes not only uterine contractions, but also contractions of the muscles around the milk glands. So this time, the oxytocin is going to cause contractions of those around of the muscles around the milk glands, and that will squeeze the milk out of the milk glands. It will also cause some weak uterine contractions, which is kind of like exercise for the uterus. It helps keep it or get it back into shape. Once suckling stops, milk will stop moving from the milk glands, and after a few days, milk will stop being produced. Lactation is a very taxing thing for a woman's body. A woman can produce around 1.5 liters of milk a day. Some women produce much less than that, and some will produce a bit more, but that's kind of an average. But lactation does cause women to lose about 50 grams of fat and 100 grams of lactose sugar a day, which can be really hard on the woman's metabolism. She might not be getting enough energy for her own cells and therefore be really tired. Lactation also causes the mother to lose 2 to 3 grams of calcium phosphate every day, and that loss of calcium phosphate will result in a drop in the mother's blood calcium level. When the blood calcium level drops, as we learned about in the endocrine system, that will stimulate the parathyroid gland to release parathyroid hormone. And the parathyroid hormone then breaks down things like bone in order to increase blood calcium levels. So some mothers that don't have enough calcium in their diet will have enlarged parathyroid glands because they'll be constantly stimulated. They'll have decalcified and weaker bones. They'll have their teeth deteriorate, stuff like that. With that being said, the World Health Organization does recommend that women breastfeed exclusively for 6 months, and then after that, alternate between breastfeeding and other forms of food until the baby is at least 2. Here in North America, a lot of women don't breastfeed for that long. Most women stop around the time that the baby starts growing teeth. But there are places in the world where protein is really scarce, and therefore it's hard to get those nutrients to the baby. And in that case, some women will breastfeed for 5 to 6 years instead. Okay, so this is just kind of a flow chart summarizing that birthing process. So at the beginning, we have the placenta releasing relaxin, and then the relaxin stimulating the cervix, vagina, and pelvic ligaments to all relax. Then we have the fetus releasing cortisol. The cortisol is going to cause the progesterone to be converted into the estrogen. That is going to result in a decrease in progesterone, which stimulates labor. It's also going to result in an increase in estrogen, which stimulates the production of oxytocin and oxytocin receptors. The oxytocin binds to the oxytocin receptors and causes uterine contractions. Those uterine contractions then stimulate sensory neurons to send an impulse to the posterior pituitary, which releases oxytocin, which causes more uterine contractions, which causes the posterior pituitary to release more oxytocin, and that is our positive feedback loop. And then we also have prostaglandins, which also cause uterine contractions. Then we have our lactation process here, which is really 2 separate processes. The first is producing milk. So we have estrogen, which is causing prolactin to be secreted, but we also have the placenta producing progesterone, which is going to inhibit the prolactin from doing anything. So the prolactin is building up in the blood, but nothing is happening as long as the progesterone is there. But once the placenta is excreted as after birth during the birthing process, it's no longer going to be there producing progesterone, so the progesterone level will fall. That drop in progesterone means that the prolactin is no longer inhibited and is now good to go ahead and stimulate the mammary glands to produce milk. The second half of that lactation process is actually secreting the milk. That starts with the baby suckling, which stimulates the sensory neurons. The sensory neurons send an impulse to the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. The oxytocin causes the muscles around the milk glands to contract, which causes the milk to be secreted. The oxytocin also causes weak uterine contractions.